My father's watch started ticking 10 years after his death. It was a heavy silver chronograph, a beautiful Swiss piece he'd been given for his 30th anniversary at the firm. I kept it in a velvet-lined rosewood box on the mantelpiece in his old study, a room I had preserved just as he'd left it. The air in there still smelled faintly of him, of old books, pipe tobacco, and the cedar logs he always kept beside the hearth. For a decade, that watch had been a silent, motionless testament to a life cut short. Its hands were frozen at 2:17, the exact time the paramedics had recorded his death after the fall down the stairs, a fall my Aunt Carol had tearfully described to me over the phone, her voice cracking with a grief that seemed to mirror my own. But tonight, as a storm raged outside, pressing against the old house with a low, mournful howl, a sound cut through the silence, a soft, rhythmic, impossibly familiar sound. Tick-tock, tick-tock. I froze in the doorway, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold in my hands. The sound was coming from the mantelpiece, from the rosewood box. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady metallic pulse of the watch. It was impossible. The watch was a manual wind. Its power reserve would have been exhausted in less than 2 days, not 10 years. It hadn't been touched, wound, or serviced since the day I placed it in that box. I set my cup down on his mahogany desk, my hand trembling so badly that the porcelain rattled against the wood. Slowly, I approached the fireplace, my eyes fixed on the box. The ticking grew louder, more distinct, each sound a tiny hammer, blow against the fragile shell of my composure. It was real. I wasn't imagining it. Lifting the lid felt like opening a tomb. There, nestled in the faded black velvet, the silver case gleamed in the dim lamplight. The slender second hand was sweeping in a perfect fluid circle. It was alive. A cold dread, slick and oily, slithered up my spine. This wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a message from the great beyond. My father was a man of logic and reason, an engineer who believed in physics, not phantoms. He would have looked for a rational explanation, and so I had to as well. Someone had been in this room. Someone had opened this box and wound this watch. My blood ran cold at the thought. The only other person with a key to this house was my Aunt Carol. She'd been my rock since my parents' deaths. My mother had passed from cancer years before my father's accident. Carol was my father's younger sister, and she'd stepped in to manage his estate, to help me through the dizzying maze of legalities and paperwork, to be the maternal figure I so desperately needed. She visited weekly, bringing groceries, home-cooked meals, and her special blend of herbal tea she swore would help with the chronic fatigue and dizzy spells I'd been suffering from for the past year. She'd been here just this afternoon, fussing over the dust on the bookshelves and insisting I drink a full pot of her calming brew. Had she gone into his study? Had she opened the box? But why? Why wind a dead man's watch? It made no sense. It was a bizarre, pointless act, unless it wasn't pointless, unless she was looking for something. My eyes scanned the room, the familiar space suddenly feeling alien and unsafe. The shelves were lined with my father's books on structural engineering, physics, and history. His leather armchair sat empty by the fire. The desk was neat, just as I'd left it. Nothing seemed out of place, but the watch ticked on, a relentless metronome marking a time that shouldn't exist. It felt less like a resurrection and more like a warning, a countdown. The ticking wasn't just a sound, it was a message telling me that something was wrong. The carefully constructed piece of my life, The quiet solitude I had curated in the wake of my grief was a facade. The silence of the past 10 years had been broken, and I had the terrifying feeling that whatever had been lying dormant was now finally starting to move. I looked at the hands of the watch. They no longer read 2:17. They now showed the correct time, 9:43 p.m. Someone had not only wound it, but had also set it. This was no accident, this was deliberate, and the only person who could have done it was the woman who had just left my house, the woman who held my trust as tightly as she held the spare key in her purse. My aunt. The thought was a betrayal so profound it left me breathless. But the evidence was there, ticking away on the mantelpiece, each second a confirmation of a violation I couldn't yet understand, but felt deep in my bones. The storm outside intensified, and the ticking of the watch seemed to sync with the pounding of the rain. A secret, sinister heartbeat in the heart of my father's home. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and deceptively calm. But the watch was still ticking. I hadn't slept. I'd spent the night in my father's armchair, the rosewood box on my lap, listening to its steady rhythm and trying to piece together a puzzle that had no edges. The idea that Carol had let herself into the study and meddled with my father's most personal effects felt like a sharp, physical blow. Our relationship was built on a foundation of her unwavering support and my absolute trust. She was family. She was all I had left. Doubting her felt like doubting the ground beneath my feet. I needed to understand why. I called her, my voice unnaturally bright, as I asked if she'd left her reading glasses behind. It was a flimsy excuse, but the best I could manage. "Oh no, dear, I have them right here," she answered, her voice warm and syrupy, as always. "Is everything all right, Alara? You sound a bit strained." "Just tired," I lied, my heart thudding. The storm kept me up. "You poor thing, it's that awful fatigue of yours. I'll bring over a stronger batch of my tea this afternoon. That will perk you right up." The mention of her tea sent a chill through me. For the past year, as my health had mysteriously declined, she had become my self-appointed caregiver. Doctors had been useless, running tests that all came back normal, shrugging their shoulders and suggesting it was stress or depression. Carol, however, had been certain. It was a weak constitution, she'd say, just like my mother's, and her herbal blend was the only thing that seemed to help, or so she claimed. It would clear the fog from my head for a few hours, though the exhaustion always returned with a vengeance. "Carol," I began, trying to keep my tone casual. "I was just tidying up Dad's study this morning, and I noticed something odd. His old watch. It's working." I held my breath, listening for any hint of surprise, any flicker of confusion in her voice. There was a beat of silence. It stretched for a second too long. "Oh," she finally said, her voice smooth, unruffled. "How strange. Maybe the storm shook it up a bit. Old things can be funny like that." It was a dismissive, nonsensical explanation. A watch like that didn't just shake itself back to life after a decade. She was lying. The certainty of it settled in my stomach like a cold, heavy stone. She knew. She had done it. After we hung up, I walked back into the study, the ticking watch pulling me in like a siren's call. If she was in here, she wasn't just admiring the decor. She was looking for something. I started to search, not knowing what I was looking for, only that a pristine, untouched room now felt like a crime scene. I ran my hands over the spines of my father's books, pulled them out one by one, shaking them gently. Nothing. I checked behind the paintings, under the rug, inside the empty fireplace. Nothing. Then I turned to his desk. It was a massive antique partner's desk, with drawers on both sides. I had gone through it superficially after he died, sorting out bills and personal papers, but I had left the deeper, more personal drawers untouched. It had felt too much like an intrusion. Now that reticence was gone, replaced by a desperate urgency. I started with the main drawer. Old pens, paper clips, a beautifully crafted letter opener. Beneath a stack of blank stationery, I found a small leather-bound journal. It was his. I had never seen it before. My hands trembled as I opened it. His familiar, neat handwriting filled the pages. It wasn't a diary of daily events, but a log of his thoughts, his projects, his worries. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning for anything related to Carol. Near the back, I found it. An entry dated just 2 weeks before his death. Carol came by today. More questions about the estate finances. She seems convinced I'm hiding assets, that I'm not being transparent about the value of the portfolio. I tried to reassure her, but I saw that look in her eye. The same one she had when we were kids, right before she'd do something to get me in trouble. She has a hunger to her, a resentment I don't think she even understands herself. She says it's for my own good, that I need her help managing things since Helen passed, but it feels less like help and more like circling. My breath caught in my throat. Circling. The word was venomous, predatory. My father, a man who never spoke ill of anyone, had seen something in his sister that I had been blind to for a decade. I kept reading. Another entry from the day before he died. Met with George from the bank. He confirmed my suspicions. There have been unauthorized inquiries into my accounts. Small probing transactions that were later reversed. The digital trail leads back to an IP address I recognize. It's from Robert's office computer. Robert, her husband. I feel sick. She's not just circling anymore. She's closing in. I have to talk to her. I have to confront them both. I'll do it tomorrow. I've put the new will and the original stock certificates in a safe place. She'll never find them, not in a million years. A choked sob escaped my lips. The new will, stock certificates. He was hiding them from her. The fall, the accident. It wasn't an accident. The thought exploded in my mind, a blinding flash of horror and clarity. He was going to confront her, and the next day, he was dead. And for 10 years, she had played the part of the grieving sister, the loving aunt, all while managing the very estate she had been trying to plunder. The ticking of the watch on the mantelpiece was no longer just a sound. It was an accusation. Carol hadn't just wound a watch yesterday. She had been in here continuing a search she'd been on for a decade. She was still looking for whatever my father had hidden from her. And the watch, a silent witness for 10 years, had become her unwitting accomplice. Its ticking a signal that the monster I thought was a memory was still very much alive and walking the halls of my house. The world had tilted on its axis. The woman who brought me soup when I was sick, who held my hand at my father's funeral, who I had leaned on for a decade, was a monster wearing my aunt's face. The realization didn't come with a rush of anger, but with a paralyzing, ice-cold fear. My father hadn't fallen. He had been pushed, and I, his only daughter, had been living under the care of his killer. The journal lay open on the desk, my father's words, a ghostly indictment from the past. He had known. He had seen the greed in her eyes and had taken steps to protect his legacy, to protect me. But he had underestimated her ruthlessness. He had planned a confrontation, and she had planned a murder. Now the pieces began to click into place with terrifying speed. My own mysterious illness, the constant fatigue, the brain fog, the dizziness that kept me dependent and housebound. It had started so gradually, I had barely noticed, chalking it up to lingering grief. But now I saw it for what it was, a systematic weakening, a way to keep me docile, confused, and under her control. And her tea, the special herbal blend she brewed with such loving care. What was in it? Every sip I had taken felt like a betrayal of my own body. The ticking watch was the loose thread that was unraveling everything. Her greed had made her careless. After 10 years of fruitless searching, she must have been getting desperate. She thought I was too sick and too passive to notice her snooping. Winding the watch was an act of supreme arrogance, a small private moment of control in my father's sacred space, never imagining it would become her undoing. I knew I couldn't confront her, not yet. She had killed once without hesitation. If she suspected I knew the truth, I had no doubt she would do it again. I was living in the same house where she had murdered my father. The staircase loomed in the hall, no longer just a set of steps, but a monument to his death. How many times had I walked up and down them, oblivious? I needed proof, hard proof. My father's journal was damning, but it was just his word. I needed something concrete, something that would stand up in court, and I needed to protect myself. The first step was to stop drinking the tea. The thought of pouring her next delivery down the drain filled me with a small, defiant thrill. But I couldn't just refuse it. She would become suspicious. I had to pretend. I had to play the part of the frail, grateful niece a little longer. My husband, Liam, was due home from a business trip in 2 days. I felt a surge of panic at the thought of being alone in the house until then. But I also knew I couldn't tell him over the phone. This was too big, too monstrous. I needed to see his face, to have him here with me before I spoke the words aloud. Until then, I had to be smart. I had to be my father's daughter. I went back to the desk, my mind racing. I've put the new will and the original stock certificates in a safe place. She'll never find them. Where? Where would a man like my father, an engineer who thought in terms of structure and logic, hide something so important? Not in a bank vault. She had clearly been able to probe his accounts. It had to be somewhere she would never think to look, somewhere in plain sight. I spent the rest of the day searching, my movements quiet and deliberate. I looked inside hollowed-out books, checked for false bottoms in drawers, tapped on the walls looking for hidden compartments. Nothing. I felt a rising tide of desperation. I needed that will. It was the key. As evening fell, I found myself back in front of the mantelpiece, staring at the ticking watch. It had been her mistake, her single arrogant mistake. What had she been doing right before she touched it? What else was on this mantelpiece? There were a few framed photos, me as a child, my parents on their wedding day, and a heavy, ornate brass clock that hadn't worked in years. It was a beautiful, intricate thing, a gift from my grandfather. My father had loved it, but he'd never been able to get it to keep time properly. I remembered him tinkering with it, frustrated. I picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. I turned it over, examining the back. A small brass plate covered the clockwork mechanism, held in place by 4 tiny screws. It was unlikely, but my father was a man who appreciated complex machinery. He loved things with hidden gears and secret functions. My fingers fumbled with the screws, my heart pounding. I finally got them loose and pried the backplate off. And there, tucked neatly inside the silent, dusty clockwork, was a small oilskin pouch. My breath hitched. With trembling hands, I pulled it out and unfolded it. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a thick, legal-sized paper, folded multiple times. I opened it. It was his last will and testament, officially signed and witnessed, dated the week before his death. It appointed his lawyer as the executor and left his entire estate, without exception, to me. It explicitly superseded all previous versions. It cut Carol out completely. The second set of documents was a sheaf of original, watermarked stock certificates for a tech company he had invested in during its infancy. Their value must have been astronomical. This was it. This was her motive. The will she had presented after his death, the one that made her co-executor and gave her significant control over the finances, must have been a forgery or an older, invalid version. For 10 years, she had been managing my inheritance, siphoning it off, all while searching for the real prize. The watch ticked on, a steady, triumphant rhythm. I had found it. I had the truth in my hands. But the truth was a dangerous thing. Now my own countdown had begun. I had 48 hours until Liam was home, 48 hours to pretend to be a sick, helpless girl, while a killer brewed poison in my kitchen. The next 2 days were the longest of my life. I existed in a state of hypervigilance, every nerve ending frayed. The house, my sanctuary, now felt like a cage I shared with a predator. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside the window sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I moved the oilskin pouch, tucking it deep inside a winter boot at the back of my closet, a place so mundane I hoped it would be safe. I forced myself to maintain my routine. When Carol arrived that afternoon, a cheerful whirlwind of false concern, my heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. "Elara, darling, you look so pale," she cooed, placing a large thermos on the kitchen counter. "I've made you an extra strong batch of the restorative tea. You must drink every drop. We need to get some color back in your cheeks." I smiled, a brittle, fragile thing I was sure would shatter. "Thank you, Carol. You're too good to me." The words tasted like ash in my mouth. I watched her bustle around the kitchen, her movements familiar and proprietary. She was so comfortable here, so at ease in the home of the man she had murdered. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. She poured me a steaming mug, the dark aromatic liquid swirling with what I now knew was not kindness, but malice. My hand shook as I took it from her. I raised it to my lips, pretending to take a sip, the steam warming my face. I held the hot, bitter scent in my lungs, and then lowered the cup. "It's delicious," I lied, my voice a hoarse whisper. She beamed, her eyes crinkling at the corners, in a perfect imitation of warmth. "I knew you'd like it. Now I have to run a few errands, but I'll be back to check on you this evening. You just rest up and finish your tea." As soon as the front door clicked shut behind her, I rushed to the sink and poured the contents of the mug down the drain, rinsing it thoroughly. But I didn't pour out the thermos. An idea, cold and clear, was forming in my mind. I needed proof that she was poisoning me. I found a small, sterile glass jar I'd saved from some fancy jam and carefully poured a sample from the thermos into it, sealing it tightly. I hid the jar in the same boot as the will. It was a tangible piece of her crime, a small vial of liquid evil. The rest of the day was a torturous waiting game. I feigned sleep when she returned that evening, listening to her footsteps as she moved through the house. I heard her go into the study. I lay perfectly still in my bed, my ears straining, my body rigid. I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the watch from downstairs. Was she standing in front of the mantelpiece again, frustrated, wondering what she had missed? Did she suspect the watch had given her away? The minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, I heard her leave, the sound of her car pulling away, a temporary reprieve. Liam was flying in the next day. I just had to make it through one more night, one more day. The following morning, I woke with a new resolve. Fear was a powerful motivator, but so was anger. A cold, hard rage was beginning to burn away the edges of my terror. She had taken my father from me. She had stolen 10 years of my life, my health, my security. She would not take anything else. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just go to the police, not yet. A grieving niece with a wild story about a ticking watch and a 10-year-old will? They would think I was delusional, unstable. Carol, with her years of carefully cultivated community standing and her concerned aunt act, would run circles around me. I needed more. I needed to catch her in her own words. Liam's flight was scheduled to land at 3 in the afternoon. I planned to pick him up, and on the drive home, I would tell him everything. But before that, I had one more performance to give. Carol was due for her morning visit. I set the stage carefully. I put on my most worn-out pajamas, left my hair uncombed, and smudged a little dark eyeshadow under my eyes to look even more exhausted. I practiced a weak, trembling voice. When she arrived, I was ready. I told her I felt worse than ever, that the dizziness was so bad I could barely stand. Her face clouded with that perfect, practiced sympathy, but I saw a flicker of something else in her eyes. A glint of satisfaction. It was all I could do not to recoil. "Oh, you poor, poor child," she said, her voice dripping with pity. "It seems this bug is more stubborn than I thought. Perhaps we need to increase the dosage of the herbs." She bustled to the kitchen to prepare the tea. While her back was turned, I discreetly activated the voice recorder app on my phone and slid it under a cushion on the sofa where we would sit. My heart was a frantic bird beating against my ribs. This was it. She brought the tea, and I made a show of drinking it, thanking her profusely. Then I began. "Carol," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I've been thinking about Dad's estate. I feel so guilty leaving it all to you to manage. I know it's a huge burden. Maybe it's time we brought in a professional firm to take over." I watched her face. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Nonsense, dear. It's no burden at all. It's my pleasure. Besides, those firms charge outrageous fees. We have to be careful with your father's money. It's what he would have wanted." "I know," I said, looking down at my hands. "It's just, I was reading some of his old papers. He was so meticulous. He mentioned some tech stocks, some early investments. I can't find any record of them in the statements you've shown me." The air in the room grew thick and heavy. Her mask of kindness began to crack at the edges. "Your father was a wonderful man, Ilara, but he wasn't a financial genius. Some investments pan out, some don't. You're not well enough to be worrying your pretty little head about these things. Just leave it to me." Her tone was no longer warm. It was sharp, dismissive, patronizing. "But he wrote that they were very valuable," I pressed, my voice trembling for real this time. "He wrote that he'd put the certificates somewhere safe, somewhere you would never find them." That was a mistake. I had gone too far. Her eyes, which had always seemed so soft and brown, hardened into chips of cold stone. The transformation was terrifying. "You've been going through his things," she said flatly. It wasn't a question. "You shouldn't do that. It will only confuse you." "I'm not confused, Carol," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I'm starting to see things very clearly." She stood up, her movements suddenly sharp and angry. "You are sick, Alara. Your grief has clouded your mind. I am trying to take care of you, just as I took care of your father." The threat was unmistakable, hanging in the air between us like a drawn blade. "Just as I took care of your father." My phone was recording. I had it. I had her. Now I just had to get her out of my house and get myself to the airport, to Liam, to safety. Liam's face was a mask of disbelief, then horror, then pure, unadulterated rage, as I told him everything on the drive home from the airport. I played him the recording. The shift in Carol's tone, the veiled threat, it was all there. He held my hand so tightly his knuckles were white, his jaw set like granite. The man I had married, the kind, gentle man I loved, looked capable of violence, and in that moment I was grateful for it. We were a team. I wasn't alone anymore. "We're going to the police," he said, his voice low and firm. "Right now." "No," I insisted, my own resolve hardening. "Not yet. Listen to me, Liam. We have the recording, the will, and the tea sample, but she'll have a story. She'll say I'm unstable, that I'm imagining things. She's had a decade to build her reputation as my loving caregiver. We need to be smarter. We need to set a trap she can't escape." We spent the next hour formulating a plan, our fear fueling a cold, calculated strategy. We would use her greed against her. That was her weakness, the one thing my father had counted on. The next morning, Liam called a trusted friend of his, a detective in the city's financial crimes unit named Miller. He explained the situation in broad strokes, suspected long-term fraud, forgery, and a possible connection to a wrongful death. He didn't mention the poisoning yet. We wanted to handle that part ourselves. Miller agreed to meet with us discreetly that evening and advised us on how to proceed. The plan was simple and terrifying. We would dangle the one thing she wanted more than anything right in front of her, the stock certificates. I called Carol, my voice laced with a feigned, shaky apology. "Carol, I'm so sorry about yesterday," I began, the words sticking in my throat. "You were right. I'm not well. I was confused and I said terrible things. Please forgive me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. "Of course, darling," she said, her syrupy voice back in place. "I understand. You're under a lot of stress. I want to make it up to you," I continued, my heart pounding. I kept looking through Dad's things, and I found what he was talking about. A pouch. It has a new will and some old stock papers. I don't understand any of it. Liam is here now, and we were hoping you and Robert could come over for dinner tonight to help us make sense of it all, to put things right. The bait was laid. The silence on the other end of the line was electric. I had just confirmed that her decade-long search was over. The prize was within her grasp. "We'll be there," she said, her voice tight with suppressed excitement. 7 o'clock. The hours leading up to their arrival were a blur of tense preparation. Liam set up 2 small hidden cameras in the study, one focused on the desk, the other with a wider view of the room. He also put a fresh pot of coffee on and a separate, identical-looking thermos filled with Carol's own poisoned tea, which we'd reheated. The plan was to offer her a cup of her own medicine, both figuratively and literally. Miller and his partner would be waiting in an unmarked car just down the street, ready to move in on Liam's signal. At precisely 7, the doorbell rang. My stomach clenched into a tight, painful knot. Liam squeezed my hand. "We do this together," he whispered. I opened the door. Carol and Uncle Robert stood on the porch, their faces arranged in expressions of loving concern. Robert was a quiet, unassuming man who had always lived in Carol's shadow. Looking at him now, I saw the weakness my father had hinted at, the complicity that had allowed this to happen. "Elara, Liam, so good to see you," Carol said, sweeping in and giving me a hug that felt like being embraced by a snake. We made small talk in the living room, the tension so thick I could barely breathe. Then Liam cleared his throat. "Why don't we move into the study?" he said. "Elara has something to show you." We all filed into the room where my father had spent his last days. The ticking watch on the mantelpiece seemed to grow louder, a steady, judgmental metronome. I sat behind the desk, my father's desk, and placed the oilskin pouch in the center of the blotter. Carol's eyes locked onto it, a flicker of raw, naked greed in their depths. "This is what I found," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I slid the new will across the desk towards her. She snatched it up, her eyes scanning the first page. I saw the moment she realized what it was, the way her face paled, then flushed with anger. "This is a fake," she hissed, her voice losing its gentle cadence. "A forgery." "It's not," Liam said calmly. "It's been notarized and witnessed. It supersedes the will you filed." Robert began to sweat, looking nervously from Carol to Liam. He was the weak link. "And these," I said, pushing the stock certificates towards them. "These are what you've really been looking for, aren't they?" Carol stared at the certificates, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. This was the moment of truth. She had lost. The inheritance she had killed for was legally, irrevocably mine. I expected her to scream, to deny, to fight. But instead, a slow, chilling smile spread across her face. "It doesn't matter," she said softly, her eyes flicking towards me. "A will is no good if the beneficiary can't enjoy it. Elara is so very sick. It's a tragedy. Her health is just so fragile." It was a confession, a declaration of her intent. She was telling me to my face that she would kill me too. My blood ran cold, but I held her gaze. "Would you like some tea, Carol?" Liam asked, his voice dangerously quiet, as he stepped forward with the thermos. "You look a little stressed. Elara saved the special batch you brought over this morning. She thought you might need it." The color drained from her face. She stared at the thermos as if it were a loaded gun. The trap was sprung. Carol's composure finally shattered. Her eyes, wide with panic, darted from the thermos in Liam's hand to my face, then to Robert, who looked as if he was about to faint. The confident, calculating woman who had held my life in her hands for a decade was gone, replaced by a cornered animal. I don't want any tea," she stammered, backing away from the desk. "Robert, we're leaving." "Leaving so soon?" Liam said, his voice deceptively calm as he blocked the doorway. But we have so much to discuss. For instance, the interesting results from the lab test Ilara had done yesterday. Her doctor was very concerned about the levels of colchicine in her system. It's a substance derived from the autumn crocus, odorless, tasteless. In small, steady doses, it mimics the symptoms of a chronic autoimmune disorder. It causes fatigue, confusion, organ damage. In a large enough dose, it's fatal. Every word Liam spoke was a hammer blow, dismantling her reality. I watched her face contort, a mask of disbelief and fury. "You're lying," she spat, her voice a venomous whisper. "She's sick. She's always been weak, just like her mother." "Is that what you told yourself when you were brewing your special tea?" I asked, my own voice rising, filled with a strength I didn't know I possessed. "Is that what you told yourself when you pushed my father down the stairs?" "I didn't touch him," she shrieked, the sound raw and desperate. "He fell. It was an accident." "He was going to confront you, wasn't he?" I pressed, standing up from behind the desk. "He found out you and Robert were trying to access his accounts. He wrote it all down in his journal. The day before he died, he wrote that he was going to talk to you." "What happened, Carol? Did he threaten to expose you? To cut you off?" Was all this? I swept my arm around the room, at the house, the life he had built. Worth more than your own brother's life? Robert finally broke. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands, and began to sob. "I told you it was a mistake," he choked out, his words muffled. "I told you to leave it alone, Carol, but you wouldn't listen. You never listen." "Shut up, you fool," she screamed at him, her rage now turned on her co-conspirator. "You were just as involved as I was. You wanted the money just as much." "I didn't want anyone to get hurt," he wailed. "He was your brother." It was all out in the open now, the ugly, festering truth of their greed and betrayal. It was more than we could have hoped for. The hidden cameras were capturing every word, every tear, every confession. Liam pulled out his phone and sent a single text message, now. "It's over, Carol," Liam said, his voice flat and final. She looked at him, then at me, her eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was chilling. The mask was completely gone. This was the real Carol. This was the monster who had lived behind my aunt's smile. For a terrifying second, I thought she was going to lunge at me. She took a step forward, her hands clenched into fists. But then we heard the sound of footsteps on the porch, followed by a firm, authoritative knock on the front door. Carol froze. Her head whipped towards the sound, her expression one of utter disbelief. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a dawning, abject horror. She understood. This wasn't a family argument. It was a sting. Liam walked to the door and opened it. Detective Miller and his partner stepped inside, their presence filling the room with an immediate, indisputable authority. "Carol Sterling, Robert Sterling," Miller said, his voice calm but unyielding. "You're both under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and on suspicion of the murder of David Sterling. You have the right to remain silent." Carol didn't scream or fight as they cuffed her. She just stared at me, her face a pale blank canvas of shock. All the life, all the fire had gone out of her. She was just a hollow shell, the evil inside her finally exposed to the light. As they led her away, her eyes met mine one last time. In them, I saw no remorse, no regret. Only the cold, bitter fury of being outsmarted. Robert went quietly, still weeping, a pathetic, broken man. After they were gone, the house fell into a profound silence. It was a different kind of silence than the one that had filled this house for the past 10 years. That had been a silence of grief, of absence. This was a silence of peace, of release. I walked over to the mantelpiece and looked at my father's watch. It was still ticking, tick-tock, tick-tock. A steady, persistent heartbeat. It had served its purpose. It had woken me up from a decade-long nightmare. I reached out and gently picked it up, the cool, heavy silver, a comforting weight in my palm. Its ticking was no longer a countdown to danger, but a reminder of the truth, a testament to a father's love that had reached across time to save his daughter. I held it to my ear, listening to the intricate, beautiful sound, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt safe in my own home. The weight of fear I had carried for so long was finally beginning to lift. The aftermath was a whirlwind of legal proceedings, police interviews, and media attention that I did my best to avoid. The evidence we had gathered was overwhelming. The video and audio recordings from the study captured their confessions in irrefutable detail. The lab results confirmed the tea sample from the thermos was laced with a lethal concentration of colchicine. The new will was authenticated, and a forensic accounting investigation uncovered a decade of systematic embezzlement from my father's estate, with funds being funneled into offshore accounts under Robert's name. Carol's entire life, her reputation as a devoted sister and community volunteer, was a meticulously crafted lie. When faced with a mountain of evidence, Robert confessed to everything in exchange for a lesser sentence. He detailed how the confrontation with my father had happened. My father had presented them with the evidence of their financial probing and told them he was cutting them out of his life and his will. An argument had ensued at the top of the stairs. Carol, in a fit of rage and panic, had shoved him. It was a single, violent push, but it was enough. My father, caught off balance, had tumbled backward down the long, steep staircase. Robert admitted they had hesitated before calling for help, waiting to ensure he was no longer breathing. They had staged the scene to look like a simple, tragic accident. The poisoning plot against me had been Carol's idea alone, a desperate long-term strategy to gain final control of the assets she still couldn't locate. If I died from a mysterious, untraceable illness, she, as my next of kin and co-executor, would inherit everything. She had been slowly, patiently killing me for over a year. At her trial, Carol remained defiant. She pleaded not guilty, her lawyers attempting to paint me as a vindictive, mentally unstable heiress, and Liam as a manipulative fortune hunter. But the recordings didn't lie. Her own words convicted her. Listening to them, played in the courtroom, her voice shifting from saccharine sweetness to cold-blooded menace, was surreal. It was like watching a horror movie where you already know the ending. She was found guilty on all counts: murder, attempted murder, fraud, and forgery. The judge gave her a life sentence with no possibility of parole. I was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She looked at me from across the room, her face impassive, but her eyes were filled with the same cold hatred I had seen in the study that night. She would go to her grave hating me, not for what she had done, but for the fact that I had survived. The legal battle was over, but my own recovery was just beginning. It took months for the poison to fully leave my system. My body had to learn how to function again without the constant, low-grade assault. The fatigue and dizziness slowly faded. replaced by a strength and clarity I hadn't realized I'd lost. Waking up in the morning and not feeling like I was moving through a thick fog was a revelation. It was like seeing the world in color for the first time, after years of living in black and white. But the physical healing was easier than the emotional. How do you recover from a betrayal so absolute? The memory of Carol's kindness was now tainted, every warm gesture, every comforting word revealed as a calculated move in a long, cruel game. It made me question everything, doubt everyone. But Liam was my anchor. He was patient and unwavering, reminding me that the evil of one person could not be allowed to extinguish the goodness of others. He helped me reclaim my home. We redecorated the study, replacing the heavy, dark furniture with things that were light and airy. We wanted to fill the room with new memories, with life. But some things I kept. I kept my father's books, his armchair, and the beautiful brass clock. And of course, the watch. It sits on my new desk now, no longer in its velvet-lined box, but out in the open. I wind it every morning. Its ticking is a constant, comforting presence, a reminder that time moves forward. It no longer marks the moment of his death, but every moment of my life that he saved. I found the rest of my father's journals hidden in a secret compartment in the same desk. They were filled with his love for my mother and me, his hopes for my future. Reading them, I felt his presence more strongly than I had in years. I learned that the tech stocks he had hidden were from a company he truly believed in, not just for its financial potential, but for its mission to connect people. He had left me not just wealth, but a legacy of his own forward-thinking optimism. Selling a small portion of those stocks allowed me to set up a charitable foundation in his and my mother's names, funding engineering scholarships and cancer research. It was a way to turn the money that Carol had been willing to kill for into something good, something that honored their memory. The house is quiet now, but it's a good quiet. It's the quiet of peace, not of secrets. Sometimes, when I'm working in the study, I'll pause and listen to the steady tick-tock of the watch. It's a sound that once filled me with dread, but now it fills me with gratitude. It's the sound of a second chance, the sound of truth, the sound of a love strong enough to outlast death and expose the darkness. It's the sound of my father's heart, still beating for me after all these years. The years that followed were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. With Liam by my side, I slowly rebuilt the trust that Carol had shattered. We filled the old house not just with new furniture, but with new life. We hosted dinner parties, holiday gatherings, and filled the quiet halls with the sounds of laughter and friendship. We were determined to overwrite the dark history of the place, with a future defined by warmth and love. The foundation became my life's work. I immersed myself in reviewing scholarship applications from bright young engineering students, many of whom reminded me of my father in their passion and ingenuity. I read proposals from dedicated researchers working on cutting-edge cancer treatments, feeling a profound connection to my mother's memory. The money, which had been the root of so much evil, was now a catalyst for immense good. It felt like a rebalancing of the scales, a final definitive victory over Carol's greed. I never heard from her directly again, but I would occasionally see her face in news articles about her appeals, all of which were denied. Her image was always the same, a harsh, unrepentant woman whose crimes had become a cautionary tale in true crime documentaries. I felt nothing when I saw her, no anger, no pity, just a distant, clinical emptiness. She was a ghost from a past life, a chapter that was now firmly closed. Uncle Robert served his sentence and was released after 7 years. He sent me a single, handwritten letter filled with remorse and self-loathing. He explained that he had been a weak man, easily manipulated by a dominant personality, but he made no excuses for his actions. He knew he was complicit in my father's death and the subsequent cover-up. He asked for nothing, not forgiveness or contact, but only to state for the record that he lived with his shame every day. I never replied. Forgiveness was a complex terrain I wasn't ready to navigate. His role in the nightmare was undeniable, and while his regret might have been genuine, it couldn't undo the damage. My healing required boundaries, and he had to remain outside of them. My own health returned completely. The lingering effects of the poison faded into memory, and with them, the psychological fog that had clouded my judgment for so long. I felt sharper, more alive, more myself than I had in my 20s. It was a strange and wonderful rebirth, an awakening that I owed to the most unlikely of triggers, a ticking watch. That watch remained the symbolic heart of our home. It sat on the desk in the study, its silver case polished, its face clear. Winding it each morning became a ritual, a small moment of reflection and gratitude. It was a memento of my father's foresight, a symbol of the intricate, invisible machinery of justice, and a personal reminder that even in the darkest of times, one must keep listening for the truth. One day, a few years after the trial, I was sorting through a box of my father's old engineering schematics when I found a small folded note at the bottom. It was in his handwriting. To my dearest Alara, it read, "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and that you have found your way through the puzzle I left behind. I am so sorry to have burdened you with this, but I feared I was running out of time to protect you in any other way. Trust your instincts. They are stronger than you know. The world is full of complex systems, but the most important ones are love and truth. They will always, eventually, find their equilibrium. Your loving father." Tears streamed down my face as I read his words. He had known somehow that I would need this message. He had left me not just a will and a warning, but a final piece of fatherly advice. He had believed in my strength long before I did. That note became my most treasured possession. I had it framed and placed it on the desk, right next to the watch. They were a matched set, the mechanism and its purpose, the puzzle and its key. They represented the beginning and the end of the story. The watch had started ticking to warn me of a present danger. But my father's note was a message for the future, for the life that came after. It was about how to live, not just how to survive. It was about trusting in the fundamental goodness of the world, even after seeing its deepest ugliness. I finally understood that my father hadn't just been an engineer of bridges and buildings. He had been an engineer of hope. He had structured a plan that relied on the eventual triumph of truth and on my own inner resolve. The watch starting to tick wasn't a coincidence or an accident. It was, in its own way, the final gear clicking into place in a long and patient machine he had designed to save my life. The house is quiet tonight, but it's a living quiet, filled with the gentle hum of a peaceful life. Liam is asleep upstairs, and the only sound is the soft, rhythmic pulse of the watch on the desk beside me. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It's the sound of time reclaimed, the sound of a life that is truly, fully, and finally my own. The journey from victim to survivor, and finally to something resembling a victor, was not a straight line. There were days when a shadow of the past would fall over me, when the clink of a teacup or the sight of a staircase would send a phantom chill down my spine. The trauma was a part of my story, an indelible scar on my memory. But scars, as I came to learn, are not just marks of a wound. They are proof of healing. They are a testament to the fact that something broken can become whole again, perhaps even stronger in the repaired places. Liam and I made a conscious choice to not let Carol's actions define the rest of our lives. We could have sold the house, moved away, and tried to erase every trace of what had happened. But that felt like letting her win, like allowing her evil to have the final say over a place filled with so many good memories of my father. Instead, we chose to stay and sanctify it with our own happiness. We planted a sprawling garden in the backyard, turning the soil and coaxing life from the earth. The physical act of nurturing something, of watching flowers bloom and vegetables grow, was profoundly therapeutic. It was a tangible act of creation in the face of so much destruction. We adopted a rescue dog, a goofy golden retriever we named David, after my dad. His boundless energy and unconditional affection brought a new joyful chaos to the quiet house. Hearing his paws skittering across the hardwood floors became a sound of home, replacing the echoes of fear. The foundation continued to grow, and my role evolved from a simple administrator to an active advocate. I started speaking at universities, sharing a sanitized version of my story, not for sensationalism, but as a case study in forensic accounting and the importance of estate planning. I talked about the red flags my father had seen, the steps he had taken, and the vital importance of trusting one's instincts. It was a way to empower others to turn the very specific horror of my experience into a universal lesson about vigilance and preparedness. It was also a way to honor my father's methodical mind, showing how his logical, evidence-based approach had ultimately been his most powerful weapon. One of the most difficult yet necessary steps in my healing was reconnecting with the rest of my family. My father and Carol had been the only two siblings, but we had a web of cousins and distant relatives who had been shocked and horrified by the news. Initially, I had shut them all out, unsure of who might have known or suspected anything. But over time, I realized that I couldn't let Carol's betrayal poison every branch of my family tree. I reached out, tentatively at first. What I found was a shared sense of grief and bewilderment. They, too, had been deceived by her performance for decades. Rebuilding those relationships was a slow process, but it was essential. It reminded me that Carol was an anomaly, a dark star in a constellation that was otherwise filled with decent, loving people. They had lost a cousin and a friend in my father, and in a way, they had lost Carol long before her crimes ever came to light. Together, we mourned the man she had been and the woman we had all mistakenly believed her to be. Years later, Liam and I welcomed a daughter of our own. We named her Helen, after my mother. Holding her in my arms for the first time in the safety and warmth of the home my father had built felt like the final, perfect closing of a circle. I was no longer just the daughter who had been hunted. I was a mother, a protector, the start of a new generation. The line of love and family that Carol had tried to sever was now stronger than ever. When Helen was old enough to understand, I knew I would have to tell her the story, not to frighten her, but to teach her. I would tell her about her grandfather, David, a brilliant and brave man who had loved his family so fiercely that his forethought had reached through time to save me. I would tell her about the darkness that can sometimes hide behind a familiar smile, but also about the incredible power of truth to bring that darkness to light. And I would show her the watch. I would let her hold its heavy silver case and listen to its steady, rhythmic ticking. I would explain that it was more than just a timepiece. It was a symbol of her legacy. A legacy not of fear or betrayal, but of resilience, intelligence, and an enduring love that is the most intricate and powerful mechanism of all. It's the engine that drives us forward, that heals our wounds, and that keeps ticking, strong and true, long after the silence has fallen. The house is peaceful now, filled with the gentle sounds of a sleeping baby over the monitor. I sit in the study, the watch on my desk, my father's final note in its frame beside it. The life I have now is one he would have wanted for me. It is a life built not on the ashes of the past, but on its strongest foundations. The watch ticks on, a quiet, constant companion. It no longer counts down to anything. It simply counts. It counts the seconds, the minutes, the hours of a life I was never supposed to have. A life that is precious, peaceful, and profoundly, beautifully normal. And for that, I am eternally grateful.